Good morning. My name is Shamia Fagan. I use she, her pronouns, and it is my honor to serve as Oregon's 28th Secretary of State. Our mission at the Secretary of State's office is to build trust between the people of Oregon and our state government so that our public services can make a positive impact in people's everyday lives. And one of the best tools that we have to build that trust is our audits division. The way that they systematically evaluate whether or not our state policy and our scarce state resources are making the biggest impact in the lives of Oregonians who need them the most. Today, we're here to release an audit that is deeply personal for me. On a spring day in 1997, my older brother was driving us from the Dalles to Portland to see our mom for the first time in, at that point, probably 3 or 4 years. My dad was a single parent raising us in Wasco County, and my mom was in and out of our lives because she battled meth and heroin addiction and was homeless for much of my childhood. But she finally had a home. She sent us a letter, given us an address, and asked us to come visit. And my brother pulled up to a beautiful, big Victorian-style house with a big wraparound porch. And my mom greeted us and walked us around to the front steps. But instead of walking up the steps, she dropped to all fours and she crawled into the porch. And then she invited us into her home. And my brother and I dropped to all fours and crawled into the porch behind her and spent an afternoon with her on a sleeping bag that she had unzipped so that we weren't just sitting on dirt. And she showed us a little box that she kept with her. It was full of pictures of us and letters from us. I know that she kept that so that even on her darkest days, she knew that she was somebody's somebody. A few years later, in October of 2014, when she passed away, she'd been clean for almost 6 years, and she was living in the first house she'd ever owned, a little 900 square foot. I'm getting a call on here. Is that? I don't know if it interrupted that. Here we go.
Apologies for the interruptions, everyone.
Yep. When she passed away in October of 2014, she'd been clean for almost 6 years and was living in the first house she'd ever owned, a little 900 square foot bungalow up in Umatilla, Oregon. And the minister who spoke at her service really captured my mom's journey perfectly. The minister said, Trish, that was my mom's name. She said, Trish reached the place of an ordinary life, just an ordinary life, a job and a house and a dog. But it didn't just happen to her. She fought for it with everything she had in her. I know that today many Oregon families are sharing the same struggles that my family faced. We have an affordable housing crisis, and we can see the impacts of it all around us. And that's why, as your Secretary of State and the state's chief auditor, I directed the audits division to perform an audit of our state's largest housing subsidy, the 100-year-old mortgage interest deduction. Today, we released the findings of the $1.1 billion mortgage interest deduction. This is the single largest tax expenditure dealing with housing in our entire state budget. In short, the mortgage interest deduction allows some, but not all, homeowners to deduct the interest from their mortgage on their taxes, including vacation homes. In its 109-year history, the mortgage interest deduction has never been audited. And I want to say that again. In the 109-year history, thinking of the housing policy for the last 100 years, when unmarried women couldn't even get mortgages, when Black and Indigenous and other people of color in Oregon couldn't get mortgages, when redlining prevented Oregonians of color from living in certain neighborhoods with high home values. In its 109-year history, the mortgage interest deduction has never been audited until today. The findings of this audit are a wake-up call. To put it simply, the state's largest housing subsidy, costing Oregonians just $1.1 billion just this budget cycle, primarily benefits wealthy, white homeowners in the urban counties. While we have Oregonians all across our state and BIPOC communities struggling with affordable housing, this is simply indefensible. The audit also finds that the lack of review of the mortgage interest deduction means that this spending lacks accountability for these inequitable outcomes. I can't help but compare this to the fight that we have every time to help working families stay in their homes, to help houseless people. Every dollar spent keeping seniors in their homes, helping first-time homebuyers, helping organizations build affordable housing, helping renters stay housed, or helping shelter our houseless population is deeply scrutinized and debated. Meanwhile, for over 100 years, billions of dollars have just walked out the back door with no questions asked, because the benefits go primarily to people with power. I can't think of a worse example of waste and systemic inequities than that. Today, we're joined by housing advocates who are going to help illustrate why we need affordable housing in Oregon, why we need a racial justice lens for all of our public policy, and to help us understand the mortgage interest deduction and its impact in the housing market today. I want to thank each of you for your participation today. I also want to thank our audits director, Kip Mehmet, and our incredible audits team for your hard work and your professionalism. Our audits team takes great care, and they adhere to strict standards of quality and professionalism, and we are really lucky to have you working on behalf of Oregonians. I'm proud to work alongside you to give Oregonians the accountability and the transparency they can expect from their Secretary of State. With that, I'd like to introduce Emily Ryman, the CEO of Dev Northwest.
Thank you, Secretary Fagan, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emily Ryman. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the CEO of Dev Northwest, a nonprofit community development agency and affordable housing developer that serves Lane, Lynn Benton, Marion, and Clackamas counties. We're so pleased to be here this morning helping shine a spotlight on the hidden impacts of Oregon's mortgage interest deduction for two central reasons. The first is this: Dev Northwest cares deeply about first-time and affordable homeownership, especially for people of color and others who have been systematically excluded from homeownership for decades. And the state's mortgage interest deduction just isn't relevant in that work. For more than 40 years, Dev Northwest has helped thousands of low and moderate income Oregon families achieve their dream of homeownership through classes, through individual counseling, and through financial assistance. We know from this direct experience that the mortgage interest deduction plays almost no role in creating a pathway to homeownership for working class families, either as a motivating force or as a financial tool. It's good to see our experience backed up by the audit being released today. When our clients talk about why they want to buy a first home, the list is lengthy. Stability for their families, building equity, not being at risk of eviction, having the asset to pass to their kids, being able to garden and adopt pets, but the mortgage interest deduction isn't on the list. Likewise, when most of our families are making the tough financial decisions leading up to buying their first home, the mortgage interest deduction is nowhere in that calculation. Some of our families don't even itemize their taxes and will see zero benefit. For the rest, the modest benefit barely registers at tax time, let alone being a meaningful tool to help them get into homeownership. Now, to be clear, Oregon has good tools that help people achieve first-time homeownership: down payment assistance, match savings IDA programs, the Oregon bond mortgage. We know what works, and we need more of what works to help Oregonians overcome a historic unaffordability crisis. But the mortgage interest deduction isn't one of those things. The second reason is that in the midst of a historic housing crisis that stretches to all four corners of our state and spans the full spectrum of the housing continuum from shelter to homeownership, we need our state to be strategic with every dollar it can carve out for affordable housing. We have youth in our state who are aging out of foster care into homelessness. We have seniors with chronic medical conditions that are being discharged from hospitals onto the street. We have generations of families from communities of color who were redlined out of homeownership for decades. We have shovel-ready affordable housing projects that can't get funding because there are 3 times more projects than there is money available. And yet the largest housing subsidy in Oregon disproportionately benefits wealthy homeowners. And that simply isn't right. I can't wrap my head around the notion that it's a good use of state funds for Oregon to provide a housing subsidy for the top income earners, including for their vacation homes. I hope this audit sparks substantive conversation and ultimately real policy changes to ensure that Oregon's housing resources are used where they are needed most, including more effective ways for supporting moderate income homeowners in our state. It's now my pleasure to introduce Marcundy, Executive Director of the Coalition of Communities of Color. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Marcundy. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition of Communities of Color. We're a 19-member, culturally specific nonprofit organization. We serve the Tri-County area largely, but we also serve around the state of Oregon, providing social services, advocacy, research, leadership, and in this case, areas of housing. Thank you, Secretary Fagan, for letting me speak here today on behalf of the many, many Oregonians who work every day to pay their fair share of taxes into the system, but who do not reap equal benefits from the system. Specifically, that significant percentage of Oregonians who are not homeowners and cannot take advantage of what turns out to be the 7th largest expenditure by the Department of Revenue that is in your budget, the mortgage interest deduction, the MID. When you came to the Coalition of Communities of Color over a year ago to talk about some of the audit topics that were on your to-do list as the newly elected and installed Secretary of State, prominent among them was the efficacy of the home mortgage interest deduction policy at the Department of Revenue, whose audit was, quote, to examine the efficacy and impacts of the statutory MID. What that recently completed audit confirmed, and why we are gathered here today, was the certitude that you, our members at CCC, and non-homeowning Oregonians have long known ever since this historically unevaluated policy was instituted, that the mortgage interest deduction unjustly subsidizes high-income households and expands racial disparities. This non-revelatory fact is revealed in your own findings, that the top 1% of earners in Oregon garner more benefit from this MID than the bottom 40% of earners in Oregon. That urban counties, not only, but such as Clackamas, Multnomah, and Washington, reap a disproportionate amount of the benefit. That when the factor of race is cross-matched with other existing data sets for home ownership, the bleak yet predictable outcome is that the historical discrepancies in home ownership for communities of color have remained at the same dismal rates for the past 20 years and worsened in some cases, even though the latest census reminds us that BIPOC communities are the fastest growing communities in the state of Oregon. Sadly, your findings are not unique. A recent National Low-Income Housing Coalition and Brandeis University report reflected similar, if not more, dispiriting results, and the CCC's own 2019 report on housing justice in Washington County, one of the counties your results revealed were disproportionately benefiting from the MID, concluded results consistent with both. So what is Oregon to do about it? First, it is to honestly acknowledge where we are. As Sean Connery, Oscar-winning Untouchables character Officer Malone once famously said, Mr. Ness, everybody knows where the booze is. The problem isn't finding it. The problem is who wants to cross Capone. To take a bit of license and to paraphrase a bit, Oregon, everybody knows what the problem is. The problem isn't finding it. The problem is who wants to fight for equity and fairness and make the necessary changes. You will find such recommendations for change in the Secretary of State's report and in the reports I reference as well, and many others. Those should be our template to begin. That, and perhaps scheduling an audit more than once a century. With courageous leadership at the state of Oregon willing to unravel the truly bloated ball of the thousands of strands of inequitable and frankly, sometimes bad policy strings that represent its revenue system, and in partnerships with community-based organizations like CCC, and most importantly, and supported by the very citizens most impacted by this long-standing disadvantage. Let me know if I got to rewind. You get the point. We can change this system to one that reflects equity, fairness, and inclusion in the bounty that is Oregon. Finally, I would simply add this simple call to action. Make this change by the end of the next seminal legislative session. We've had common sense reform bills looking at this for years. We've spent time talking about addressing the minority homeownership gap for years. We have this racially inequitable tax break right here, and it's time to make this change. So thank you for your time and attention. Please be bold and act now. And with that, I'd like to introduce Chris. Excuse me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Chris Spahner, and I've been a full-time residential realtor in the state of Oregon since 1990. I'm here today to give the perspective of someone who's watched thousands of buyers make decisions about whether to buy and what to buy. I've also seen who gets the opportunity to make those decisions and who doesn't even make it that far. This audit confirms what we have suspected for some time. The mortgage interest deduction is not an effective tool to promote homeownership or to help affordability. It mainly helps wealthy, white, urban homeowners to buy higher-priced homes by subsidizing their mortgages. When we hear that mortgage interest deduction helps housing affordability, we really need to ask, who does it help and what does it help them afford? I'm sure most taxpayers are not going to be happy to hear that the largest single expenditure in the state of Oregon that makes housing possible is not helping our housing crisis, and not for the right people. Right now, I talk weekly with folks who would love to buy a home, but are struggling to save for a down payment. They don't come from generational wealth, and a family can gift them the down payment. They might be battling student loan debt, medical debt, things that make them unable to qualify for a loan. Even if they jump these hurdles, they end up having a hard time being competitive in this incredibly crazy environment of rapidly rising home prices. The money Oregon spends on this tax break does nothing to address these issues and will not get them into a home or help them keep it. If Oregon is going to spend $1 billion every 2 years during a housing crisis, it should do more for us than reward those who already have access to the powerful advantage of owning real estate. I think it should provide opportunities for those Oregonians who could not do so otherwise. This is the intention of any subsidy, to help level the playing field. It is especially critical to recognize that the government policy, realtors, and the very Constitution of Oregon have in the past literally forbidden individuals from accessing homeownership purely based on the color of their skin. From 1919 to 1950, the National Association of Real Estate Boards Code of Ethics demanded that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values. The audit shows that this antiquated tax policy doubles down on this historic exclusion, with the vast majority going to white homeowners. We have some real harm to undo. And the results of this audit point firmly in the direction of using that money to right those wrongs. It is part of the current National Association of Realtors legislative agenda, thank goodness, to close the racial homeownership and wealth gaps. And I invite all realtors to be brave and to take on this conversation, to have the courage to change a system that we've come to expect but is causing harm and preventing our fellow Oregonians from enjoying the empowering and financially stabilizing feeling of homeownership. This will be good for our industry, good for our communities, and good for Oregon. Thank you for your time.
Good morning. My name is Kip Memmott. I'm the Office Director for the Oregon Secretary of State's Office. My pronouns are he and his. Welcome today. We appreciate your interest in this important audit. I want to thank Secretary Fagan for her amazing personal story and her amazing support for this function. This was her vision. As she noted, it's been it's never been audited, but it is not uncommon for auditors not to look at tax policy. So under her leadership, we are so excited to engage in this. And I want to note, we just issued our 2022-23 audit plan, and there's additional audit work in tax policy in that plan, and there will, I think it's safe to say, Secretary, be audits throughout the Secretary's term and hopefully beyond, because this really, as the Secretary points out, this is quintessential to public trust, to transparency in government. And the audit standards that the Secretary referred to that we adhere to that ensures that you as the public and the media can count on an objective audit report here. Those standards require us to specifically assess the efficient and effective use of state and public resources. And as one of the largest expenditures of public resources, this is obviously right within our bailiwick, and we're really happy to present this audit and really do hope it propels some change in discussion. I'll stop here with just acknowledging some thanks to the Department of Revenue. The Department of Revenue's leadership and their team were outstanding, collaborating with us. I'll call your attention to the response letter. I think there's some interesting comments about tax policy and review in there as well. And their team was just really great in getting us the data and helping us brainstorm some of the methodology and testing we've been doing. And I'm going to close by just thanking not only our great speakers here and for all the advocacy support you do out for our community, but for our audit team. And they're going to come up here and help get to your questions, which is, I want to introduce Olivia Roquette, who is our audit manager, John Bennett, who is the lead auditor, and Hillary Hahn, who is the staff auditor on the project. And with that, Ben, I'll turn it back to you for some to facilitate the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So we're able to hear you through Zoom, just like a regular Zoom meeting. So we can go ahead and start taking questions. There are two ways to do this. One, you could drop your questions in the chat, or you could raise your hand and we'll call on you. I'm going to step to the side where I can see you all on a computer, and I'm going to invite the audits team to come on up and stand behind the podium here. And we'll get started. Thank you. All right, so our first question is from JR at the Oregonian.
Hi there, this is Jayati Ramakrishnan at the Oregonian. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you all for your information today. A couple of questions. The first is, other than this being a 99-year-old program, or sounds like older actually, that has never been audited, was there any other specific issue or tip or anything that prompted this audit being conducted now?
Sure.
So this was part of the first, I'm Secretary Fagan, and nice to hear you. This is from the first audit plan that I was able to conduct as Secretary of State. And, again, our mission is simple: to build trust. And knowing that we're living through an affordable housing crisis, and have been. Obviously, I talked a story about my mom, and that was almost 30 years ago. And this is something that our state has been facing, but it is not new. And so it was a matter of looking at our housing policy and so, okay, where are these dollars going? And to find that the largest housing subsidy had never been audited in 109 years meant it was long overdue, and I was happy to help make that happen with our audits team.
Thank you. And then the other question I had was, I saw in that the first recommendation is to find like a clear purpose for this policy. Do you recommend, I know there have been several bills proposed in the last 5 years that have recommended making significant changes or doing away with portions of this tax policy, such as the second home portion. Are there any other specific changes that you recommend or would like to see, that you can talk to us about right now?
Hi, Kip Nevin again. Specifically, from the audits division, we sort of are left to the boundaries of the report. Those are our recommendations. And it's a really key point you're raising. From the audit perspective, we don't set policy. That's for the legislators and other folks to do who are charged with that. What we do is bring if you will, a snapshot of objectivity of how policy is working. So if you'll notice how we've even framed the findings in this report, it's just a matter of fact of what the policy looks like and some of the negative impacts of that policy. As far as what stakeholders want to do with addressing this policy, or perhaps using revenues for other purposes, we really defer to them on that from the audit perspective. So yeah, we're limited to what we kind of just recommend in the report. Thank you.
Looks like the next question is from Claire Lifter.
Hi, good morning. I'm wondering why previous efforts to change or reform the mortgage interest deduction in the legislature in the past few years have failed, and do you believe, I guess this question is for Secretary Fagan, is this report intended to move the needle on reform efforts?
Well, thank you, Claire. First off, as the chief auditor of the state, our mission is always to move the needle, right? We want to build trust, and we want to have public services that make the scarce resources of the state actually make a positive impact in people's lives. Obviously, I was in the Oregon House and the Oregon Senate, so certainly spent time as a legislator during those conversations around reform. And I'll just be frank, there is a myth that the purpose of the mortgage interest deduction is to help promote homeownership. But this is the first time ever in 109 years that professional strict auditing standards have looked at that and said, first off, that's actually not the stated purpose. But even if you say, okay, it's become the purpose, it's not doing it well. If the purpose, as in our values want stable housing for Oregonians, if the purpose is to get Oregonians housed and homeownership and keep people in their homes, we certainly encourage the legislature to evaluate policies that could maybe do that more effectively with the state's largest housing subsidy than the way that money is currently being wasted. As I mentioned, this is an example of waste and systemic inequity, and we certainly encourage the legislature to have those policy conversations.
At this time, I'm not seeing any additional questions, Claire or JT. Do you have any follow-ups?
I do have a follow-up question. I guess I'm wondering, it's been clear from the research for several years now that the mortgage interest deduction is inequitable. And so I guess I think that's become that idea has gotten a lot more popular, and I think people are talking about it more. So I guess I would be curious, is there any other reason that these reforms have been able to pass? Is there industry opposition? Do lawmakers themselves benefit from the mortgage interest deduction, and so there's not much interest in changing it? I would like to know.
We'll certainly have to rely on your journalism and skills to go kind of answer some of those questions. We can't answer those today from an auditing perspective. What we can offer is that this audit is the first audit, right? Our auditors follow the Government Accountability Office standards. Well, there's certainly been studies. Perhaps folks have been able to dismiss those, but this is an audit from professional auditors in the Secretary of State's office following the Government Accountability Office standards. And that is a first in its 109-year history in Oregon, and we certainly expect and hope that it will have an impact.